Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. My guest today is Ed Center, and Ed is a parenting coach, and he was a child with big feelings and impulsive behaviors, and now he helps grown-ups to understand and support these kids. During the height of the pandemic, Ed's son suffered an acute mental health crisis. Searching for support, Ed discovered the field of positive parenting and learned strategies and tools to strengthen his connection with his son, leading to healing for the whole family. However, Ed was frustrated with a lack of attention to diverse cultures and traditions. He founded the Village Well to bring more connection, joy, and healing to families of color. Ed and his husband raised 2 boys and 3 cats in San Francisco. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation with Ed. Wherever you are coming from, whatever you are bringing to this conversation, Ed talks a lot about raising kids in a different way than you were parented, and whether that is from a different culture than, white American culture, or whether it is from a more authoritarian style of parenting, a more traditional American style of parenting. I think that you'll find a lot to relate to if you are feeling torn between your family and where you came from and wanting to do things differently. That's what Ed talks a lot about. I also love just hearing his story and his evolution as a parent. We got into triggers, we got into connection, we got into, parenting our complex kids. And I just will invite you to have a listen and let us know what you think of this episode. If it's something that resonates with you, share it with a friend, and be sure to check out Ed and his work. It was just a joy to speak with him. In fact, after I interviewed him for our summit, which you may have caught a few weeks ago, I asked him to also come on the podcast because I just loved talking to him. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and that you learn a lot and you gain some understanding about yourself and where you came from and how that affects your parenting. Let's dive in and meet Ed. Hello, Ed. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to hear and see you, Sarah.
So you and I were just talking before we started recording about what exactly we were gonna what we're gonna focus on in this podcast.
Yeah.
And our conversation started to get juicy. So I decided to just hit record, which is not necessarily the way that I usually do these podcasts.
Right.
So everyone here is going to be along for the ride with us because you and I both know the general things that we're interested in speaking with each other about. And it sort of stems out of your experience as a brown dad of Filipino descent, and your personal experience with your child and where that led you in terms of wanting to do responsive parenting. Is that correct?
That's 100% correct.
Yeah. And sort of where you came up against wanting to practice parenting in a different way, but it was different from what you knew. So why don't you just start us out there with your story, and we're going to see where that takes us.
Go ahead.
So I was just going to say this is going to be a interesting conversation, I think, for anyone who's wanting to parent in a different way, but specifically people who have come from cultures where responsive parenting is not the norm.
Yeah, and I will say that I think there's actually a beauty into this winging it and trying to figure it out as we go, because I think for folks of color who are trying to hold some of their cultural values in their families and parenting while also interrupting some of the unhealthy cycles that they've experienced, there isn't a script for it, and it's hard to find support. And we wander in the metaphorical desert for a while looking for connection and help and community and making tons of mistakes. And so I think the parallel of us saying, what the heck are we talking about this morning, is kind of helpful and indicative.
That's awesome. I love that.
of a journey that I've been on. So I will say that I am a queer brown dad. My husband and I adopted two kids from foster care. They are biological siblings, and we adopted them at different times. So we got our older kiddo when, so we're making the transition from he to they at their request. So when they were 6 months old. And then 6 years later, we had an unplanned gay pregnancy where we
Which
got,
is really hard to have, quite frankly.
yeah, we got a call from the city saying, we have this 6-week-old baby boy, and here's, are you and I was like, why are you calling me? And the social worker said, I forgot to say, this is the biological brother of your older kiddo. And so I screamed. And then we met that kiddo the next day. And then he moved in with us 4 days later.
Wow, that's fast.
Right. And so I did have a conversation with my boss saying, so I'm pregnant and I'm very, very pregnant. And so, yeah, that was our interesting, fun, and fast journey. So what I found is that in parenting both of those kids is that there were elements of my culture that I felt strongly about and wanted to bring in to raising my kids as their cultural values as well. So part of that was extended family, so cousins as your first best friends. And I grew up in a very strong tradition of service, and so we have continued that with my kids. Things like outdoor play is sacred time, right? My mother would never ask me to come in to do work if I was outdoor playing or reading. Those were the two ways that I could escape chores and any other expectations. And so I'm passing those on to my kids as well. And then there are other things that I don't want to pass on, such as respect for adults that is
Right.
unquestioned.
The
Right?
fear based. When people say
Yes.
respect, but what they really mean is fear.
Yes. Yeah. And I want my kids to be able to advocate for themselves and negotiate and hold boundaries. And when they do that, I often find myself triggered. And that came to a head in the beginning of the pandemic when my older kiddo went through a really bad mental health crisis. And so we now know that they have ADHD and dysgraphia, which is like dyslexia for writing. And virtual schooling was never going to work. But I am a former educator and have worked in the youth development field my entire life. And so you give me 25 teenagers that are other people's kids, and I got this. So I definitely have one kid on virtual learning, right? I did not have one kid. I did not have it at all. And it resulted in these power struggles, which I interpreted as him being lazy and defiant and stubborn.
Disrespectful.
Yes, yes, which are all defiant and stubborn are definitely family traits of ours as well.
We like to call that strong-willed.
Yes, yes. And so I was interpreting this as a battle of strong wills, even as the evidence in front of me was showing that he was getting worse and worse, and it was getting darker and harder. And there came a point where I told him that he needed to brush his teeth in order to get more TV time. And that led to a 2-hour screaming fit in which they punched holes in the walls, threw things at me, called me all kinds of names that I didn't know was in their vocabulary. And it was so clear that this was not just a power struggle. It was so clear that he was slipping into this darkness, but I could not disengage. I didn't know how.
So you
And
were as triggered as he was, it sounds like,
I
as hijacked.
Yes, and those behaviors touched something deep in me that made me want to suppress, dominate, threaten, cajole in order to maintain power, authority, hierarchy, right? And I knew that was wrong. I didn't know how to disengage. I went to try to find parenting coaching for myself. And when I was calm,
And let me just say, you're a parent coach now, but you were not a parent coach then.
not at all.
Yeah.
right? I had some experience in education, but I was just trying to find some support. And what I found was there were some really interesting tools out there that I could not apply because I was so triggered all the time, right? And I couldn't find it in myself to connect with my kid when I was triggered. I could do hours of special time when we were calm, right? But I could not find it to stay calm and present. And then it got into this space where I felt like there were all of these people telling me what I was doing was wrong and how I was inadequate. And that's not what they were saying, right? But the approaches you're using, they're causing more harm. I had one social worker tell me that if my kiddo was pushing my buttons, if there was even a 10% chance that he could send me flying off the handle, that it was like the lottery for him. And so it was like emotionally exciting to be able to push and see if that could happen.
I
And I
mean, that just
was,
sounds like plain terrible advice.
isn't it?
Yes.
Isn't
I
it?
mean,
So like,
that's not the point of view of somebody who thinks kids are doing the best they can.
no. And it's also, for me, it was like, are you saying I have to be perfect every time my kid is pushing my buttons? Like,
Right.
I can't go from 80% flying off the handle and getting triggered to what I probably am now, which is about 30%, which is huge progress, right? And call that success in this worldview. And I'll be real, everyone I was in contact with was a white woman, often with a social work degree, a psychology degree. And I just felt like there were all of these white women telling me what to do and how what I was doing was wrong. And that was a really hard place to be. And as you know, folks of color go through that, many folks of color go through that experience in their lives with white folks telling us that what we're doing is wrong, or even who we are as wrong is wrong, right? And that can start in preschool, et cetera, et cetera. And so I found myself in just this very uncomfortable place. And I went out looking for a parenting coach that, in my mind, was a woman of color, that when my kiddo would do something that triggered me, she would say, that behavior is not right. I know you want to scream at him. You're not going to scream at him. Here is what you're going to do to hold your own sense of what it means to be respected, as well as meet him where he is. Right. And I could not find that person. I know now that others exist, but I could not find that person at the time. Right. And so that started me on my own journey of looking for resources and help that fit with me. So one of my trauma responses is research, right? And so I went out and I read books. I looked at indigenous practices from different groups around healing, about how we raise our kids. I talked to a ton of folks of color who had kids with mental health crises, right? And the amazing news is, one, that my kiddo is doing so much better, and that is in huge thanks to community organizations in San Francisco that work with kids with mental health issues that were so effective and powerful,
Great.
with him and our whole family. And so he's doing so much better now. And that gave me space to work on my stuff. Right. And so I went on this journey and found myself being able to do the hardest thing in parenting, which is to stay calm when your kid is not, and being able to find ways to connect with him, to hold firm boundaries, to be able to breathe and even hold a sense of humor when everything's chaotic around me. And at some point I realized I might have become the person I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if other people are looking for something similar. And so
Yeah.
that started the real journey of creating this organization called The Village Well. We are celebrating our 1 year anniversary this Friday.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so this is a place for particularly parents of color. We also work with educators to find a space for our own healing, that allows us to show up better for our kiddos, especially those who are strong-willed, who have big feelings, who have impulsive behaviors, and how to support those kiddos better.
Love it. Yeah, I'm sorry you didn't find better support when you were
Yeah.
looking for it, because I don't think you would have found that everyone would have the same suggestions that you found when you were looking for support. So that's too bad. But it's good that you didn't find it, because then you became it. So all's well that ends well, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was definitely a journey of more trauma and frustration than I needed, but something beautiful was born out of that. And so
Yeah.
I'm grateful for the experience I had, although I would never want to do that again.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So it's funny, when I was speaking before and kind of introducing our general idea of where we were going to go today,
Mhm.
I realized that I said something. Now I can't remember exactly what I said, but I said something like parenting in a new way that's different from the culture in which you were raised.
Mhm.
But I think that we have to like go back even further and recognize that a lot of cultures that do have that more authoritarian parenting style are that way, not historically, but because of like colonial oppression.
Yeah. So I'm going to start in a simpler place, which is that I have only met one parent in my life, I think, who wasn't trying to change some of the things from how they were parented to how they're parenting their kids, right? And
Hmm.
so I think that is almost universal, to have this desire to bring certain elements of our culture forward and to stop doing certain things, right? And that's where the hard work is. And so I wanted to name that. And yes, I do think that some of the ways that our cultures teach us that are appropriate in parenting actually come from particularly dark places,
Hmm.
right? And so I call it the family story and the shadow story. And so for me, my grandparents immigrated from the Philippines, and we have a family story that is about poverty in the Philippines, coming to Hawaii to work the pineapple plantations, which is actually where my grandparents met, having 10 kids together, saving up pennies in order to, and being industrious and thrifty to buy property, and then building homes on that property, and then eventually being able, their kids were poor but stable, right? They always had food and hand me down clothes, right? But then their kids were afforded education and the ability to have, through either education or the military, to move into a middle class life, right? And so it's a common immigrant story,
It was the
and
American
one,
dream.
yes, yes, and it's a story that was particularly afforded by the economies of the time, right?
Yeah.
And also is taught to us as loyalty, industriousness, hard work. It was definitely taught that you don't complain about your life because your parents and grandparents had it worse, right? And so that's the story that we were told officially. And then over time, I realized that there was another part to this story, which I call the shadow story, or sometimes I call it the kitchen story, because it's a story I learned from my mom and aunties being in a kitchen together and thinking that nobody was listening, but I was pretending to read around the corner, right? And this is where I learned good gossip in the family, but also darker parts of the story, like my grandmother being a child bride and her having no agency in her marriage, and the plantation culture that they were in, the pineapple plantation culture. People were striking all the time, and I know my grandfather participated in those strikes, and that was part of the family story we told. And those strikes were very likely to be broken up by goons, physically broken up. And also, I was told this story about how or I heard this story on paydays, they would, the men would take their families into the sugarcane fields and hide them and stand guard with cane knives because they were worried about bachelors from the other plantation camps getting drunk and coming into town to cowboy the
Mm.
women.
Mm.
And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized what cowboy
Yeah.
meant,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that all of this fear and violence and lack of agency, we didn't talk about as our family story, but it did get encoded into into the trauma that my grandparents held, that I think was passed on to their children, in part by how strict they were and how violent their behavioral practices could be, their parent rearing practices could be. And so there's a story told of my uncle who, he must have talked back or swore, I don't know what he did, but he had to kneel down and put a chili pepper in his mouth until he apologized.
Mm.
And he was stubborn, so he didn't, but he sweat and he cried until he collapsed on the floor from that pain. And I think about how, and they told that story as one of his stubbornness and will and how strong we are in some ways. And I interpret that very differently, right? As there was no room for my uncle to talk back. And so here was the punishment that he was given. And I'm trying to raise my kids in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
Although sometimes those instincts come up, right? Not in the
Well,
same
I
way,
mean, I
but
think,
don't you talk back to me.
yeah, I think your point is like those structures, those family structures, those family authoritarian structures come from somewhere in its survival, which is what I was getting at with the
Yeah.
colonialism, right? It's like a survival thing. But then when survival maybe is no longer on the table, I mean, not like literal
Mm-hmm.
survival
Mm-hmm.
because they were successful American dream people, you still have the leftover, like, well, I was raised this way. And so that's what I know, even if it's not I mean, sometimes it's a conscious, I'm going to, carry on because this is what you do. Right. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's, well, I don't want to do that because that didn't feel good to me. But whenever we are hijacked, we often revert back to what we know without realizing it. Right. Or without being able to control it.
100% right. And so what I've experienced in my work, particularly with parents of color, right, is that I start off with what's the challenge that you're experiencing, right, with your child. So is it talking back, is it getting out the door in the morning, which every one of us has, right, these things. And then first looking at how can we offer tools that will help you move through this process in a way that is easier for everybody, right? And so if you can get through moving your kid out the door by being present, by getting yourself ready 10 minutes early, and then, being playful through the process, et cetera, then the parents will find that there's more joy in that process and it's easier for everyone, right? At that point, we start to build tools and talk about what we want life to look at before we even talk about punishment or timeouts or yelling, anything, right? And so we're building that toolkit, which builds trust and then leads to a place where ultimately we can make that connection between, my mom raised me like this. It was very uncomfortable and hard, and I don't want to do the same, right? Or even a trusting place where I hear this a lot, like, I was spanked and it worked for me,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I, unlike other parenting coaches or many I've met, I don't really push initially around stopping spanking, stopping yelling, stopping authoritative practices, right? I'm building up other
Authoritarian, you
tools.
mean? That's my pet
Authoritarian,
peeve
yeah.
when people confuse
And
those two words.
and when and bringing them to a point where we can say, I hear this a lot from especially parents of color, like, I was spanked and it worked for me, right? And then we can have a conversation of, did it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If your child is doing this particular thing and it means that you fly off the handle every time that happens, is that working for you, or is that healing that needs to be done? Right? But you got to build I got to build a lot of trust,
Mm-hmm.
right? And connection with my families before we get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's how I work with parents too. I often will
Yeah.
say, like, you can't start with dropping out the punishments. You've got to work on your connection, your mindset,
Mhm.
understanding your own triggers before you can really make any big changes in how you've, been able to parent before.
Yeah, I'm curious how you think about that, Sarah, because what I experience and also see a lot, right, is coming through with talking to parents about you need to focus on connection, you need to focus on being present, et cetera, in order to support your child to get the behavior you want. And I see less of that with coach and parent creating that process first
Mm-hmm.
before we go into correcting parents' behavior, if you will. So I think I just heard you say that you are creating a process or building a process with the parents that you coach where you are establishing connection and trust and relationship before you're asking them to make major behavioral change. Is that right?
All my trade secrets are going to come out here, Ed. But my main, so I've trained a bunch of coaches myself as well. So
Mhm.
I've put a lot of thought into what my process
Mhm.
is.
Mhm.
My main goal is for parents that I coach to feel, well, my main goal is to be the champion of the child. And I
Mhm.
do that through supporting the parent, right? And the
Mhm.
champion of the child so that the child can,
Mm.
have unconditional love and independence and
Mm.
freedom. But the way to get there is through the supporting the parent. And the way I do that is by making the parent feel unconditionally loved by me, and that I bring a sense of like non-judgment and non-shaming to make parents feel understood in like whatever they've done, what that they wish they hadn't done. They did the best they could
Mhm.
with the resources that they had at their
Yeah.
disposal, and helping them understand what the patterns are, helping them understand why they get triggered, and on going at it from that point of view. And if you
Mhm.
don't start there and just say, well, just there's a Bob New I don't are you old enough to remember Bob Newhart?
Both shows, actually.
Okay. So there's a Bob Newhart comedy sketch where he has these 5-minute therapy sessions that he charges $5 for. And
Mhm.
all the people do is you come in and they say, like, I'm afraid of flying. And he says, well, just stop it. Just stop it. Like every time they say their
Yeah.
problems, his answer is
Yeah.
just stop it. Right.
Uh-huh.
And so, I am very careful not to operate from that
Yes.
level. Right. So,
Yes.
and in terms of whether when I
I just
recommend
wanna
for
say millennial and Gen Z parents listening, you can come back now. We're done with Bob Newhart. Please
All right.
return.
The Gen X stuff is over. But you can look it up. You can look up that skit. It's hilarious. So basically, like, I never would start with, well, you just have to stop, giving timeouts or spanking or
Yeah, yeah,
yelling,
yeah.
right? Because, well, how do I do that? How
Right.
do I do that, right? And of course, nobody thinks it feels good to do those things, right? So it's kind of like, well, if you could just be the parent you want to be by sheer willpower, you already would have
Mhm.
gotten there.
Mhm. Yeah. I would add thank you for sharing that trade secret. Um, I would add that one of the things that I think is complicated for many parents, and especially people of color, although not exclusively, right, is that these the the cultural wisdom and the cultural wounds can feel so intertwined and messy with each other, right? And so it can absolutely feel so. I will say this, it often happens when I'm in a group of folks of color that people will reminisce about the physical punishments we received as children, right? And it will often become we'll be laughing, we'll be sharing stories, we will be talking, particularly with Filipino and Latina moms, about their use of the chancla, right? About how quickly their slippers could come off and smack you. And these are taught in fond stories in a way, right? And so it's intertwined in our culture about like something that a connection that we have in how we grow up, similar to like what our mother's lumpia or arroz con pollo might have tasted like, right? And so I think that we need to have more productive conversations like intraculturally, understanding like, yeah, that is something that maybe we do laugh about, and those were wounds,
Hmm.
right? And they impacted us in certain ways, whether we think they did or not, right?
Well, so
And
sorry, I have to interrupt you because I just
yeah,
had
come
sort of
on
like a
in.
bit of a brainwave, which is that
Yeah.
like what my idea of peaceful parenting is that we want to raise kids who feel like they're lovable and worthy even when they mess
Mhm.
up, even though
Mhm.
they, did this thing or whatever. That's one of the things I work with parents a lot, right? Is like
Yeah.
even though you just yelled at your kid, you're still lovable and worthy because
Yeah.
conventional parenting constructs this idea of I love you more when, or you're more acceptable
Mhm.
when, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what you're talking about is that how hard it is to extend that grace to our children, how hard it is to extend that grace to ourselves, and how hard it is to extend that grace to our parents, right?
Yes.
Like even though your, mother might have beaten you or spanked you or whatever, you can
Mhm.
still love her and you can still think that she was doing the best she could with the tools and resources she had at her disposal at the time.
So, one of the things that I have seen when we go on a healing journey, right, to really understand where those triggers are coming from and how those triggers are attached to a wound from childhood, often a behavior that we had to suppress in ourselves, right? And so, for example, the thing that triggers me the most right now is my older kiddo being aggressive towards my younger kiddo. And that confused me for a while because I'm the older child and I understand how annoying younger siblings can be, right? But the realization that that aggression, which I had for my younger brother, was punished, dominated, shamed out of me. And so now when I experience it, it's like I'm outraged at both my child and myself at the same time
Mm-hmm.
and feel a strong desire to squash that
Well,
behavior,
it
right?
it was as a child, you knew that wasn't safe behavior for you to do. And so
Yes.
it triggers you because you're like, children shouldn't do that. This is unsafe. Like this, not
Yes.
just from a parent perspective, but your
Yes.
your inner child is saying, like, don't do that. You're gonna get shamed, you're gonna get beaten, like whatever the thing is.
Yes. And to your point around forgiveness, is that I've found that all healing pathways lead to a point where forgiveness is essential. And it can start with forgiving your child, and then it can move to, if you can, forgive your parents, right, or your whoever the folks are that raised you. But the next step is the most difficult, and that's self-forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And understanding that our parents did the best that they could, maybe, or they were sick, and I'm doing the best I can. And when the wounds that I carry, I can forgive myself for having those, and then start to feel safer and operate and behave in a different way when those same situations come up. And that
See,
is a really tricky place to be in.
it is super tricky, but I would also argue that you have to forgive yourself before you can forgive anybody else.
Oh, my experience is I've found that it's easier to forgive other people, and that can lead you to that last place, which is the
Mm-hmm.
hardest.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're coming at it from different directions, but hopefully
Ending in the
ultimately the
same place.
same
I
outcome,
also
right?
I also heard something really interesting too the other day, that you can have compassion without forgiveness because you're maybe you were so wronged by your parents that you
Mhm.
might not be able to forgive them, and you can still have compassion.
Yes. Yes. The You heard me say a second ago that your parents did the best that they could or they were sick,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so sometimes if, we experience childhoods that were so abusive or so neglecting or, just terrible that it's amazing that we survived, I think there's a place, right, to hold that my parents couldn't do it and I can have compassion for how difficult life must have been for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what do you find is sort of the most helpful in terms of how you can stay in the culture and not repeat the cycles?
Yeah. So that's such a great question. And so it's very individualized. But what I find is one, if we can first name the wound that we want to work on, right? We're talking about healing here. So it's, for me, let's say it's being triggered by my older kiddo's aggression, right? And so we name it. And then we need to create space for that healing to occur. And that is time, but it's also pushing back on many of the cultural influences that we have that we call self-care but are actually numbing and distracting, right? And so by that I mean alcohol use, I mean edibles, TikTok scrolling, Netflix binging, right? And so these things actually interfere with our ability to heal. I want to be really clear. I am not against any of those things. And on a Good Friday night, I might partake in all of them, right? And that is not healing. That is me distancing myself, checking out. And real healing means leaning in, right? And so you create that space. And then I think going in and leaving and creating ways of exploring whatever the healing is you need to do in a way that is culturally congruent for that person. So, for example, if you have a strong faith practice, prayer may be really important. Talking to your pastor, priest, rabbi about the issue you're working on may be a journey of healing for you in a spiritual, faith based sense. It may be that you need to go for walks with your best friend a lot and talk this through, right? It may be journaling, meditation, therapy is great. Let's give a shout out to parenting coaches in this process, right? But ultimately it's the path that feels right and nurturing and culturally grounded for you. And I think there's a bunch of different paths to take. And that path will lead to this place of forgiveness
Mm-hmm.
where you go through that, and that can lead to behavioral change. And inevitably that's like a cycle. It will take you to a place where you realize there's a new wound to work on. I say take a break there and have some Chardonnay, right?
Sounds
Like
good.
pause, enjoy life a little bit. You've just done a bunch of hard work before you take on the next cycle.
I appreciate that. And I also just want to point out that I know a lot of people are going to be listening to this and resonating with their own upbringing, even if they didn't come from an, immigrant family or a family of color,
Mm-hmm.
because everything we're talking about, I think has that, authoritarian is authoritarian no
Yeah,
matter what color you are. But you and I have been talking about this because that's your particular lens. So I want to ask a question that I don't want people to think this doesn't apply to them, because I think it applies to everyone.
yeah,
When you are trying to make those changes, generational changes, and you are getting the disapproval from your family, your extended family, whether, I have a lot of clients who say, my brother parents the way that we were parented. And every time our families get together, I can feel the judgment, or he even says something, or my parents say things like, you're going to go let them get away with that. So what's your advice for when you are making a shift that's away from whether it's your family or your culture, and you still want to be close and be in relationship, but you are parenting a different way and you're getting pushback? How do you
yeah.
deal with that?
Yeah. So what I find is that when we are trying to parent in a different way, we always have the voice of usually our moms in our heads, right? Judging the practice. And so that's a conversation we have to have, an imaginary conversation. But sometimes the voice of your mom is actually in the room, right? And saying, oh, he needs to be spanked for this, or this is not appropriate. Or I've had, in the case of my own mom, her hit my kids when I wasn't around, and then sharing that with me as a source of pride, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, nobody talks to grandma like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I hit him and it stopped.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, as evidence of an effective practice, right? And this is a really tricky situation because I have found that in some cultures, people are very comfortable saying, these are my boundaries around how I parent my kids. These are my rules now. And you can play by my rules or you can lose access to your grandkids. Right. And I respect that decision. And in other cultural contexts, including mine, that's not possible. right? And so recognizing that I am not going to be able to change my mother's mindset. And the more I try, the more I will be frustrated by that. And she's an amazing grandmother in so many different ways. And I want my kids to have her support, and I want her support. And so, how do I create and draw those boundaries around that in what's admittedly a very tricky, constantly changing situation? And so, I don't have a straightforward answer on that in terms of, yeah, I don't have a one size fits all answer. Here's what I will say to myself for myself is that when my mom is in the picture in person, I set up very clear boundaries around what needs to happen. And then I go through certain situations that are likely to happen and tell her what my expectations are in that situation. So the last time she was here, I said, the kids are going to fight. The baby's going to start screaming. That is going to stress you out, and you're going to start screaming at the baby for screaming. When that happens, if I'm present, I will jump in as soon as possible. I just need you to back up and say nothing, right? The first two times, she could not do it. It was a disaster. But I had set that up so I could say, back up, mom, just disengage. I got this. Just disengage, right? And then I could go about for myself, moving the older sibling away and then helping the younger one, who's not actually a baby, re-regulate, right? And then the third time we had like practiced, right? And so she was able to do this. I have no idea what her mindset was in that moment. And I certainly didn't ask her for her feedback or opinions afterwards. But through practice, we were able to get to a place where I could get what I wanted and she at least got out of the way.
Right.
And
Well,
so go ahead.
I was just going to say a complicating factor, I think, is that sometimes parents don't have your confidence that you're doing the right thing. And so that, like, what about those parents who feel like they feel so much self-doubt because their parents are saying, you're doing it wrong. You're not going to let them get away with this, are you? So do you have another level? Like, 'cause I think it's very helpful what you said for parents who are confident
Yeah.
in their parenting choices and that they feel that they're making the right decisions. But I know a lot of people that I work with get super thrown off when people that they love and trust are telling them that they're doing it wrong.
Yeah. So this is also why in my approach to working with parents, I try to do as much work as possible in groups and in community, because I think it's really important to have a community of people that you trust and that believe in you to create new narratives about how we support our kids. Because if it's, one-on-one coaching and then that person goes back into, let's say you have a live-in mom or mom-in-law or dad-in-law, whatever, and you're getting those messages all the time, it's going to be really hard to push back on those. And so it's really important to have a community of people that say, yes, you are on the right track. Yes, we see you. Yes, we'll help you set boundaries. Yeah, you can practice with us, right? The hand in hand process has the listening partner, right? Which is a great place for that. But you need community in order to do this. And I also feel that for folks of color, right, community has been such a huge part of our family process for so long. And so being able to find and identify and connect with like-minded individuals who are on a similar journey as you is essential to that process.
Yeah, that's what I find with my community, especially my membership community, is that so
Mm,
many parents, either they feel, some doubt because it's not quote working and because their kids still, struggle or they still struggle,
mhm.
or they feel doubtful because they're getting this, frankly shaming from their family or even their friends or neighbors or other people that they're close to.
Yeah, I also feel like it's important to be able to I also feel like it's important to be able to figure out how to hold a sense of authority, right? Like a presence that I can hold my own boundaries. I can hold what is okay in my household without needing to shame, punish, threaten my kids, right? And so being able to do that in a way that can communicate to grandmas, grandpas, etc., that I am in control here. I have the process, even though it doesn't look like what you think it should look like, can be very helpful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when my kid is completely dysregulated and I go there and I'm calming and present, and then my kiddo swears at me, right? To be able to say, it's not okay for you to talk to me like that. We will get past that. We'll talk about that later. But right now, I need you to come into the bedroom with me so that we can try to decompress together. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm also communicating to those around me that I have the situation, I have a strategy that's in place.
Yeah, so
Right.
let's instead of saying that you have control, let's just say you have a strategy, because I think what we're trying to do with responsive parenting is to shift away from the control mindset.
I'm talking about self control.
Okay. Okay,
And I
thanks
think
for
that's
clarifying
critical.
that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but we don't always have self-control. We still do get triggered. I would like to just take away from what you said, that you've got a strategy and that you're doing things intentionally, right? And it might be that it looks like your kid is swearing at you or whatever, and that we're trying to get to understanding rather than just trying to like extinguish the behavior.
Yeah, so I do want to push there because I think a huge part of the work that we're all doing, right, is that when we feel that trigger, instead of letting it seize us and take over, that we have an opportunity to learn to hold our sense of peace, right, which I'm calling self-control,
Oh, absolutely.
in that process.
I'm not saying that's not our goal. I'm just saying sometimes it doesn't always, I mean, you said
It
yourself
doesn't always
30%.
work. Sure,
Yeah, you
sure,
said
sure, sure.
yourself
Yeah, yeah,
30% of the time
yes.
you get triggered
Yeah,
instead of 80%.
yes.
So even if it looks messy from the outside, to an observer, it's not that it's never going to look messy for you to still be able to say, like, I've got this.
Yes, yes. And I still get triggered, and I probably will at some time today.
What? You're human?
And right? But I also where I think it's really important for everyone to understand is that a lot of us feel like triggers are automatic reactions that we can't stop, right? That something happens and I'm seized control, and all of a sudden I like, see red. Is that the phrase? And I just have no control over myself. And that is not true,
Hmm.
even though it feels like that, right? And
Absolutely.
so, and as evidence to that, if your kid says something really rude to you and your boss says something really rude to you, you're probably going to have very different responses,
Hmm.
right? Even though it can feel automatic and seizing. And so, in that little space where we can judge context, right, where we can discern context, there is the hope for elongating that space and creating a more significant pause through which we can identify all kinds of tools, right?
Yeah.
Taking a breath,
I would
etc.
argue, though, Ed, that that's more than just whether or not there's the pause available to us when our boss says something or when our kid says something, because our boss and our kid are not going to trigger us in the same way in terms of touching on those wounds that you and I know have talked about in other
Mm-hmm.
conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like your boss isn't going to necessarily bring up the old wounds of your childhood like your kid would.
What I'm saying is that there is I don't know, 0.001, I'm not a neurologist, I have no idea, where we can actually discern context,
Yes.
right? Before our amygdala takes over, right? And in that space is the potential to recognize, to train ourselves. Oh, my child is not actually a physical threat,
Yes, 100%.
right?
I just wanted to like call that out because I think people often don't understand why they can stay calm if their boss is like quote
Mm,
being a jerk, where they can't yet if their kid is, triggering them, or
right.
they're feeling,
And
let me
why
take
we
that
have
back,
very
or they're
different
feeling triggered by their
reactions.
kid. Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like for me, I go into fight mode if it's my children, and I go into freeze mode if it's my boss,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
Very different
mhm,
responses to the
mhm.
situation.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting and illuminating, wonderful conversation. And where's the best place for oh, I almost forgot to ask you the question that I ask all my podcast guests.
Oh,
I'm going to ask you where we go to find out more about you, but before I get there, if you could go back in time, with your time machine and you could give advice to your younger parent self, what would that advice be?
Slow down. That's advice I give to my younger parenting self, my current parenting self, that when things are, I think that love is slow. It means we're present. It means we drop agendas. It means we accept ourselves for who we are and the human in front of us for who they are. And when we start rushing around, we lose that sense.
Slow down. I like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so where's the best place for people to go and find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah. So my website is villagewellparenting.com. Instagram is at villagewellparenting, and TikTok is at queerbrown.dad.
Love it. Well, thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. It's always great talking with you.
You too. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.